two good reasons, however, I think why reading classics is very important beyond that, what I said, which is that this is what we know. Namely, one, that it provides actually a wonderful model of how we might do social research. We think of Marx Capital as a work of theory, but if you actually read the book, it's actually full of historical, sociological details. Much of the research he did came from government reports. Right? So in some ways it's very boring in some way. And yet we read it not so much because he was a great social researcher, but simply for these models, simple models. And these models can wreak, I think, violence if you try to take them too seriously and forget a great deal of spade work, a great deal of empirical work that Marx and of course Weber engaged in. It's also a model, I think, in a second sense, because both works, especially in the case of Marx, was truly transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary if you prefer. It's hard to say that he was an economist. He was actually much more of a sociologist, and yet he talked a great deal about the state. That's political science. He talks about the organization of work. Sounds like industrial relations, business school. He talks actually a great deal about machinery, technology. And yet he tries to bring all these things together and try to make sense of the capitalist mode of production. And there's something very ambitious and illuminating in that. He's not trying to simply look for sociological dimensions, psychological dimensions, political science dimensions, economic dimensions, technological dimensions. And so therefore I believe that it's a wonderful model as we think about, or as you try to do kind of research you wish to do. The second, I think, reason is that these classics, I think, are useful to read in part because they're generative, meaning they provide questions that remain still unanswered. I think the best reason to read great books is simply because they make you think, right, and raise new questions. In all fields of research, people talk about upstream research and downstream research. Downstream research is essentially kind of doing small questions that have been done by people in upstream. And effectively, I think you can learn a lot more, not by reading the followers of Marx, but reading Marx himself. And classics always have this character that they're much more clear than the followers who wrote in the spirit of, be it Marx, Weber, Durkheim, or whoever. So just to end this kind of prefatory remark on theory, the most important thing I think one needs to understand is that theory is kind of minor at one level, but it's absolutely necessary. It's necessary because it's always a matter of having better or worse theory. Everyone has theory. Every sociologist, even though they may think they're being purely empiricist, they still implicitly have an idea about the way the world works. So it's always better to be more explicit. It's always better to have a better theory than worse theory. Secondly, I think it's important because if you try to think about the way the world works, it's in part a function of what people think the world is about. If people begin to truly believe in the possibility of democratic change, and this is what happens, or what happened in the French Revolution, for example, or the European revolutions in 1848, or any number of social upheavals. Yes, people respond to weather. Yes, people respond to poverty. Yes, people respond to all sorts of things. But ultimately, people think about what they're doing. And if you truly believe that God made you this way, God made the world this way, and can be changed, presumably you wouldn't do very much. If you truly believe that it's your genetic structure that makes you who you are, there is no point in studying sociology, and presumably there isn't much point in engaging in any political activity. It will just happen. It's just human nature working itself out. So what I'm trying to suggest is that it's not just sociologists who must have theories. It's just simply the case that everyone has social theory. Homeless person begging has a particular view of the social world. And just much as the least educated, least intelligent people may have theory, so do the rich and the powerful. And so social theory becomes also important, in part because it's one of the ways in which the world goes around. So it's always better, in my opinion, to have better than worse social theory. So just to conclude briefly, the punchline, the conclusion of what I've been trying to say is, of course, we should learn from the past. That's all we have. That's our best guide in some way. We should, of course, seek rigor. It's not good to be illogical. It's, of course, important to face reality, the way the world is. I mean, that is to say, we need to take seriously deductivism and inductivism. But we also need to hope for better, and that's the pragmatic point. Pragmatic intervention that I talk about. So in a course like this, we read and learn, because that's the first step. The Austrian-British philosopher Wittgenstein had a very good metaphor. You know, philosophy is a bit like a ladder. Once you get to the place where you want to be, you can throw it away. Similarly, in many ways, social theory is a bit like that. Although we are taught in academic life to keep on quoting. You know, it's like you are kind of like a member of Team Marx. And so you keep on saying Marx and Marxists. So you show that you're in Team Marx, or Team Weber, or Team Habermas, or Team Verdieu. But that's not the main function. Right? The main function is to let us get to the place so we can understand the world. We can look at the world in much more clear light. And so once you get there, we can throw it away. We don't need to cite Marx, Weber, or anyone else. One caution that I wanted to give before I move on is that very bright people, especially very bright first-year graduate students, are very critical. So it's like giving a 5-year-old a sword, a knife. They get excited because they can cut everything. And criticism is like that, right? You're pretty bright, you can read and you can see the problems in the argument. The logical flaws, missteps, empirical problems, argument doesn't seem to hold together, may have been true in 19th century, doesn't seem true in 21st century. You can say all sorts of things. Right? So it can be a critical critic. Just say, wrong, wrong, wrong. I'm smart, or smarter. Now the problem is that to be truly convincing, you actually need to perform two parts of criticism. The easier part is external criticism. The best example I can think of when I think about external criticism is like when you bring, I don't know, say you bring a Taiwanese person who loves jiaozi to America and take him or her to a Jewish restaurant, and they have these things called blintzes, right? Blintzes. It looks just like jiaozi. But you could say, oh, this is no good. Doesn't taste like jiaozi from home. I mean, that's true. But it's not a very good criticism. It's not a good criticism to say that this is not what I want. This is not the way I like it. I mean, you shouldn't give it up. Maybe you like what you like, and that's great. But you need to couple that with internal criticism. That is to say, you need to understand kind of the assumptions, kind of the ways in which things are built from inside out. And without taking seriously what the author was trying to argue, you're not going to be very convincing. So for example, you read Marx's Capital, and you say, he doesn't say anything about Taiwan. Well, it's absolutely true. But that external criticism in itself is completely meaningless. You can, however, try to delve into his argument, as I will try to do in part, and say it's actually problematic that he believes just by studying England, you can understand the dynamics of capitalist mode of production. And therefore, not studying, maybe not Taiwan in particular, but studying non-English society is a flaw in his argument. In any case, I just want to say that it's so much easier, actually, in general, to destroy than to create. You create from your Lego set a huge structure. It takes a long time, but only takes 1 second to destroy the whole edifice. And so the temptation to be critical critic, as understandable as it is, should be avoided. I think the more important task is to understand it so you can transcend it. Take what's good. So this will make you a better thinker, better social scientist, better human being, whatever. Okay, I know you probably know, you may know a lot about Marx and Weber, but I'm going to tell you a bit, just so that you know something. Marx was a 19th century German philosopher, as a very famous book on Marxism put it. And what's kind of interesting about him, of course, is that he didn't have a doctorate, but he had one in Greek philosophy. And in part because he was Jewish, but in part because he was a radical, he kept on running away because of government censors, and eventually ended up in London. He then met Engels, with whom he's forever associated. And of course, Engels was a son of a good capitalist, and it's one of the many contradictions of capitalism that capitalists ended up supporting a critic of capitalism. Actually, it happens all the time. It's very interesting. You know, there's a kind of Hegelian thing about internal contradiction, but it's really true. People who destroy capitalism tend to be capitalists. Just like people who hate patriarchy are often men. Anyway, there are two main ways to, I think, understand Marx and Engels. And one became politically important, and the other became less important. One is, of course, historical materialism. The part that became powerful is precisely this part, that it became kind of a secular religion, kind of a theology about the past, present, and future of human history. So he and Engels assert in Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, that the history of human life is essentially a history of class struggles. And it's eventually going to end in a telos, or the end point, for the goal of communism. I mean, I'm sure you all know this. That's kind of the theological part. The more scientific and much more usable part is his thoroughgoing materialism. And this is true in two senses, right? On the one hand, he was a thoroughgoing anti-idealist. What he means by that is essentially that the world, right, operates much less on ideas and much more on material constraints and interests. Just as much as you're drawn, you're not, you're drawn in a river or pond, not because you believe in drowning, but because of gravity. Similarly, he believes that in much of economic, political, and social life, there are forces independent of what people are thinking. And he's critical of what people are thinking in part because he believes that ideology systematically distorts the way the world works. One function of ideology is simply to give a different and false, wrong picture that is beneficial to the status quo. But in my opinion, the reason we actually should read Marx is because he was actually a very, very good social theorist, meaning he was kind of a model for what social theory can do. Now, I think this is something you know, so I'll go over this very quickly, but a lot of people poo-poo or make fun of Communist Manifesto because it's very rhetorical. But it's actually a very interesting document, and it's interesting for a number of different reasons. And I'll try to give you several reasons why this is very interesting. It became kind of popular because it was published in 1848, and that's precisely when there were revolutions throughout Western and Central Europe. So people thought he was like a prophet. Came true. It's like sometimes when you predict that depression will happen, and some economists become very famous because they happen to be right just this once. So if you keep on guessing, you'll be right sometime. It's like my colleagues, who are in economics, they said that, they're very smart people, so they're very interesting, So they said that before the 2008 financial crisis, they went around the world saying that the financial capitalism was doing very well. Nothing to worry about, right? Everything's fine. But they said after 2008, they even went around even more, telling people the financial system is not doing very well. But you're ready for both. Anyway, but it's good to be in the right place at the right time. What's interesting, of course, is that he thought he was predicting the death of capitalism, but in fact he was merely beginning to show the birth of this very, very dynamic system. Before I move on, I will say something on translation. We read so many things in translation that you probably know this, but you should be aware, right? Americans in general think that everything is written in American English. Right? So most people believe that the Bible was written in English. It's very interesting. But it wasn't. Right? And in this case, he was really a German philosopher. And the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto begins as, well, as you can read, Ein Gespenst gegen Europa. Gespenst, there must be people who play video games. It has now become a video game, so it's now become popular. It just means ghost in German. It doesn't have a very special meaning. The first translation by Helen McFarlane was a frightful hobgoblin floats through Europe. This image of this monster going throughout Europe. But the one that stuck was translation 33 years later. Spectres haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. You'll see allusions to this everywhere. Why? Well, it's a wonderful sentence. What makes it work is that it's written now. And it's something that sociologists especially always forget. Right? If you write something, you want people to read it, so you should write it well. Right? But no, you want to be a serious scientist, so you try to make it more as difficult as possible. So that's a problem. But we should also remember that translations are not always perfect. You should be aware. Okay. Why is it red still? Well, in part because was very good about making sense of what capitalism meant as a cultural manifestation. There's a wonderful line which says, all that is solid melts into air, all that holy is profane. Meaning that capitalism is a great machine for destroying what has been before and creating something new. It's what's sometimes known as the future shock. Essentially destroys tradition and puts something else in its place. So he turns out to be a true thing. You know, capitalism has encouraged urbanization that rescued from the idiocy of rural life. I mean, I actually like rural life. But in any case, it's making the world into the image of Europe. That's the point. And what's interesting is that even though he's supposed to be a communist, if you actually read Communist Manifesto, he seems to really love capitalism. I think it's one amazing thing. So he says the bourgeoisie, the capitalist, has created more massive and more costly productive force than have all preceding generations together. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? So he's trying to kind of praise, in some way, the revolutionary productivity of capitalism. And it's also most interesting to me because he was, in some way, quite prophetic about this age of globalization. Increasingly, national borders, locality, lose salience, importance, such that, you don't have to read this, such that even at the level of literature, we begin to talk about world literature. So, you know, if you were 100 years ago, living in Taiwan or mainland or wherever, you probably just read Chinese classics and popular literature. But increasingly, you live in Taiwan today and you read your, I don't know, Murakami Haruki or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Everything becomes part of OECD world literature. And the most important point is he thought that eventually there's an inherent contradiction to capitalism that will destroy it. But there are a couple other things I want to highlight. One is that it's actually a highly contextual document, meaning that it was written in 1848 in Germany. So if you actually read the demands of the Communist Party, what they wanted, right? They don't seem very radical. So they wanted income tax, which is everywhere. You know, even your conservative prime minister is for progressive income tax. Free schooling, control of transportation by government, national bank, and things like just male suffrage because you know, female suffrage would be too radical. Secret ballot, child labor laws. So the only point I'm making here is that communism seems like a frightening thing, but in retrospect, from this vantage point of 2014, in most countries today, these seem like an obvious thing. That even if you're conservative, you kind of say, yes. I mean, no one wants to make 5-year-olds work in coal mines, right? Even your prime minister, wants to make everyone work, but he's not going to say 5-year-olds should work in coal mines. And I don't think he would say only men should do it, only rich men should do it. And so, you know, the second thing I want to say is, you know, it's interesting in light of what happened by followers of Marx, that if you actually read what Marx meant by communism, they all seem kind of fine. You know, he has a very famous line in the German ideology. You know, this idea of communist society is, well, you go hunting in the morning, you go fishing in the afternoon, and cattle in the evening, and after supper, criticize. I don't know. But I think the basic idea is from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. I think that was his kind of basic idea of communism. Much less, not really the state control of productive facilities. Okay, so the book itself took him forever to write. So if you're struggling with your master's thesis or PhD dissertation or your book, take heart. It took him over 30 years to write this book. It's very funny. It was published in 1867, but in 1845, he said, he was going to finish before April, in January, like 3 more months. I have a friend, not a friend, actually, an enemy. He's an economist. But I knew him since college, so I've known him for forever. So, about 11 years ago, so he's been working on this history of 20th century history of economics. Anyway, so 11 years ago, I asked him, he was going to finish this great book. And he said, well, in a couple months. 11 years later, it's still not. It's a very common academic problem. 1851, he also said it's going to finish in 5 weeks' time. So, it's like, so be careful when you say, well, people ask you, like your advisor asks you, so we're going to be done with the thesis, 5 more weeks. Anyway, why did it take so long? Well, he called it the economic shed because he had it for so long. Well, in part because he was poor, had many kids he had to feed, have health problems, and all this is relevant, but it's not important for you. What's important for you is 2 things. One is that he loved to argue, so he kept on getting into feuds, meaning kind of these debates. So even when he was working on Capital, he would write a 350-page book criticizing Herr Volk's economic theory. Now, no one today remembers who Herr Volk was. No one. But, he was alive then, and he was annoyed that this guy was writing stuff that he thought was wrong. So he wrote 350-page book. It's a very common temptation that you feel. Right? You are trying to work on something important, but someone next to you wrote some stupid book, so you spend all this time criticizing this book. Don't bother. It's okay. Second is actually a serious issue. Probably the main reason that it took him for so long is that every time he kind of mastered a particular area, he found out that he didn't know anything about a certain area. So he would learn math, just have to understand economics better. Or sometimes he would learn that there are all these wonderful, interesting literature in Russian, so he would start learning Russian. This is very impressive, but don't do it. You'll never finish. You're kind of stuck with what you have. Anyway. So he published the first volume in 1867, died. Engels edited 2 and 3. Karl Kautsky, the leader of German Social Democrats, did 4. Basically, no one read this book. There was only 1,000 copies printed, and it took 4 years for that to sell out. And by and large, people found it so difficult to read. There was a Russian translation in 1872, and every book in Russia at the time had imperial censors. And the censor basically just said, few would read it, and still fewer understand it. I actually never understood why in Taiwan or South Korea people ever banned Marxist capital in the 1970s. Right? It was banned. Because, what better way to keep radical students away from demonstrating and studying Marxist capital? Such a long book. But, anyway, all I want to say is it's a very important book. So I asked you to read Part A, last part. Why? It seems kind of crazy, right? You read a book from the beginning. Everyone knows that, right? You pick up a book. Usually you read from introduction. Actually, many American academics I know read from the back. Do you know why? Do you know which section they read first? Okay, does anyone have a book? No one has books anymore. It's terrible.